Hi everybody, this is Mrs. Martin, and this is section 5 of the novel 910 by Nora Raleigh Baskin. We are starting again with a setting given to us, September 10th, 2001. So we are still in the morning of September 10th, but this time we are in Columbus, Ohio. And that means we are visiting the character Naheed. Naheed, as you will remember, is our Muslim character who was in the airport, was panicked by losing track of her family. She seems kind of sheltered, kind of insecure. So let's see what her life is like at school. Naheed, what are you doing? We're going to be late for science. Eliza had walked past and been heading down the hallway when she stopped and looked back. Naheed was fiddling with her locker. The combination had to be dialed and clicked in perfectly, or it didn't open and you had to start all over. This was probably why most kids just carried their books around with them all day. There wasn't enough time between periods anyway, even when your locker was cooperating. I need my science book. Naheed didn't take her eyes off her lock, starting over. 25, 15, 32. That was the number, wasn't it? You go ahead. Don't worry about me, Naheed told Eliza. In fact, please go ahead. For some reason, even though Naheed and Eliza had never been friends before, Eliza had attached herself to Naheed this year, sort of like a new puppy. And sort of in a reciprocal way, even though it was annoying, Naheed didn't mind because 6th grade was so much more confusing than 5th had been. And as strange as she was, Eliza seemed to know what to do and where to go in this unfamiliar maze of hallways and classrooms. So we'll pause here for a second. We have the use of a vocabulary word right here, reciprocal. And if you remember, reciprocal means a situation where everybody benefits. So what's the benefit that Naheed is getting from hanging out with Eliza? Take a look at the paragraph. Here it is. Eliza seemed to know what to do and where to go in this unfamiliar maze of hallways and classrooms. So Naheed, in a sense, is using Eliza for her knowledge of the school. Eliza seems comfortable there. She doesn't get lost. She doesn't seem to get nervous or be late. So that's something Naheed benefits from. If she's with Eliza, she'll always know exactly where to go. The problem is she doesn't really perceive Eliza as a friend. It says they've never been friends, right? But Eliza attached herself to Naheed like a new puppy. And she even tells us it's annoying. She's not really happy with this friendship. So this goes to show you that there are some situations where people may benefit from being around a person, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they consider that person to be a friend. Okay? Let's continue. At the same time, Naheed really didn't want to stand out any more than she already did because she was Muslim and because she wore a headscarf. And right now, Eliza wasn't helping the cause. No, really, Naheed said, focusing harder on her locker. Just go, you'll be late. Eliza took the heavy steps back toward Naheed. No, I'll wait. You probably need me to show you the way. That was nice of Eliza, even if Naheed wished she wouldn't stand so close. Everyone knew Eliza was a little weird. She wasn't too clear on personal space. But the funny thing was, up until that year, no one had really cared, or if they did, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. And then middle school started last week, and everything felt different. As if you suddenly realized you'd been coming to school in your pajamas, and you had to figure out a way to hide this fact before anyone else noticed. So some of you may actually remember experiencing something similar to this at the beginning of last year, where you just felt like everything, even though these were the same people that you had gone to elementary school with, everything felt different in the middle school building. Now, similar to what you experienced, I'm sure that Naheed has different kids coming from different elementary schools to her middle school. But it seems like she's more concerned with the way she's being judged than maybe she was when she was in her elementary building, right? It seemed Eliza wasn't going anywhere until Naheed finally got her locker to pop open and yanked out her science book. Okay, let's go. Naheed hurried down the hall with Eliza, and just before Mrs. Salinger could close her classroom door, they managed to slip inside and drop into their seats. Nice you could join us, girls. Mrs. Salinger walked over to her place behind her desk. As I was saying, we are going to use the scientific method to test these hypotheses. After every experiment, you will be required to write up your results. Mrs. Salinger stood up, a stack of papers in her arms. Here is the format you will be expected to follow. Eliza's hand shot up. Can we work in pairs? That was her question every time. Yes, Mrs. Salinger answered. If gambling were allowed in her religion, which it was not, Naheed would have bet what was coming next, because lately it seemed that the universe was conspiring against her. In fact, just that morning, Naheed had gone to pour her favorite cereal only to find out her sister had eaten the last of it. But in the short run, what she ate for breakfast wasn't going to be the deciding factor, no. Surviving middle school seemed to be predicated solely on who your friends were and weren't. So, little vocabulary break for a second here. The idea that the universe was conspiring against her. The idea of conspiring, secretly working against her. Do you really believe the universe can conspire against someone? Probably not. So this is a literary device that we've seen in our Devices the Disney Way, and it's called hyperbole. It's an exaggeration. Naheed feels like she has really bad luck lately. And so instead of looking at it and saying, wow, things have been a little challenging, she amps it up. She exaggerates it and says the universe has been conspiring against her. Okay? In addition to this, we get the word predicated. Predicated, another word from your list, is that idea of something being based on something else. So in this case, surviving middle school, according to Naheed, is based on who your friends were and weren't. So that goes to show us that she really is becoming very hyper conscious and aware of how she's being perceived by other people. I will let you know in my life experience that you would be surprised how little time people spend thinking about you and more focused on themselves and their own stuff. So I think Naheed's maybe a little, extreme about this belief. I don't think what she's saying here is accurate, but we'll read on. Sure enough, Mrs. Salinger went on. And I've already chosen the pairs, so don't bother begging. In fact, don't ask. The pairs are listed at the top of this sheet. But Mrs. Salinger, Eliza kept going. Didn't she know resistance was futile? So there's another vocabulary word. Resisting is useless. There's no point in it. Once a teacher decides, whining will not help you. Mrs. Salinger just ignored her. Take one and pass it back, she said. She counted out exactly the number needed for each row of seats. It wasn't that Eliza was so awful or anything. She just talked a lot, even and especially when she had nothing interesting or important to say. And she said things that were really odd, things most people only thought but knew better than to say out loud. So in this paragraph, we see Naheed judging Eliza really harshly. She's saying that Eliza has nothing interesting or important to say. She says things that are really odd, okay? Things that people know better than to say out loud. Naheed doesn't seem to be making room for Eliza to be different. And the reality of it is every single human being is different. There are no two people identical in any way, shape, or form, not even twins. So with that in mind, you would hope that Naheed would have a little bit of patience for someone's differences, especially since she doesn't particularly like being judged for her differences. But here she is judging Eliza harder than maybe anyone else. So it goes to show us that Naheed's got some growing up to do. Now, this year, there was a whole batch of new kids from different elementary schools combined, and Naheed swore she could feel everyone jockeying for position, like horses on a racetrack. The truth was, Eliza didn't have any real friends, and being associated with her wasn't going to put Naheed anywhere near the head of the pack. So we have a comparison here. Everyone is jockeying for position like horses on a racetrack. That is a comparison that uses the keyword like. It's comparing popularity in school to a horse race. It is a simile. But the harder Naheed prayed to Allah that her name would be coupled with someone, anyone else, the more she was sure that Eliza's name and hers would be on the list side by side. Because it was a selfish prayer. And selfish prayers don't get answered. So here she's even acknowledging that she's being selfish, right? A second later, it was confirmed when Naheed was handed the worksheet. Pair 7, Naheed Mohammadi, Eliza Grayson. Mrs. Salinger said, "You will need to come up with an experiment as a pair. Run your experiment as a pair and write up your results." Do we have to be in pairs? One boy shouted out from the back of the room. Mrs. Salinger ignored him. "Come up with your experiment as a pair," she repeated, as if she hadn't heard him at all. She wrote the first hypothesis out on the board. Sensitivity is heightened on your dominant side. There was a short discussion as to what dominant side meant. No, not who was bossier, not who weighed more. No, it was meant to determine if you were right-brained or left-brained, usually connoted by handedness. Okay, so your dominant side just simply means if you are a pitcher or a catcher or a baseball player of any kind or a softball player of any kind, you're probably well aware of whether you are right-handed or left-handed. The hand that you write with is supposed to be your dominant side. And for those of you who are ambidextrous, rock on. That's amazing. All of the pairs were expected to do today was to come up with their experiments. Tuesday, they would have to get them approved. They had the rest of the week to implement their experiments, and by Friday, their final reports were due. Chairs and desks were shifted around so the pairs could work together. Finally, everyone was settled and ready to begin. Sort of. What is your dominant side, Naheed? What kind of name is Naheed anyway? I've never known anyone else with that name. It was starting right away, like it always did with Eliza. You would think that she was really lonely and had been storing up all these questions so she could make friends, only she'd ask the exact thing that made people not want to be friends with her. She wasn't anything like Nori, but nonetheless, she made Naheed think about her little sister. Maybe people felt that way about Nori, too. Whenever someone asked Nori something about being Islamic, she sprang into action like she was a Sunday school teacher. It wasn't that Naheed was ashamed of her religion or her family, but she didn't need to wear her beliefs on her sleeve or her head any more than she already did. "It's a perfectly normal name," Naheed answered. She could practically hear her sister's voice in her head. "Naheed is a Persian name. It means honorable and blameless. Our family is not Arabic, but we are Muslim. We follow the practice of Islam. A lot of people think those two words mean the same thing, but they don't." So this is what Nori would say if Nori were there. So this is all in Naheed's imagination. But she knows her sister well enough to know exactly how her sister will react, right? So Naheed, instead of explaining to Eliza and maybe cutting off those questions by giving her a full answer, just says, "It's a normal name," because she just wants to drop it, okay? Always teaching. We are Muslim and we follow Islam. It's like saying you are Christian and you practice Christianity. Does that make sense? So again, we see Nori's voice being imagined by her older sister. Enough already. Naheed knew that she too had probably sounded exactly that way when she was 9 and had first started wearing the hijab. It shows that we are modest, that we are not looking for attention. It shows our devotion and loyalty to Islam. It is a command from Allah. It was just that lately Naheed felt that wearing her hijab was more like showing she was different from everyone else. She certainly didn't need to explain it everywhere she went. I didn't say it wasn't normal, Eliza went on. I just said I'd never heard it before, and I wondered what the etymology of your name is. The what? The origin of your name. The origin of my name is Hebrew. It comes from Elizabeth, which means pledge to God. Do you believe in God? I think we better stick to the experiment, Naheed said. She opened her notebook. Any thoughts? I think maybe trying pricking people's fingers with a pin or pinching them really hard and seeing which hand hurts more. Well, that's not very scientific, Eliza answered. Well, do you have any better ideas? Sometimes Eliza did funny things with her face, tensing her mouth, blinking her eyes a lot. Naheed had never really noticed that before, but then again, she had never really spent this much time with Eliza or been this close. They had never had a class together. Eliza looked down at her hands. I'm left-handed, she said. Well, really, I can use both hands. But I write with my left hand, I throw with my left hand, and I wink with my left eye. And if you are left-hand dominant, you are supposed to wink with your right eye. At the set of desks next to them, Tommy and Sebastian were wadding up pieces of paper and throwing them into a waste paper basket using the left hand and then the right. Mrs. Salinger was pacing the room, but she stopped at their desk and asked the boys, and exactly how does that indicate sensitivity? Tommy had some explanation about shooting hoops, but Mrs. Salinger wasn't buying it, even though it sounded pretty reasonable to Naheed. Try again, boys, Mrs. Salinger said. She tapped her watch. You have exactly 8 minutes left. Naheed looked up at the clock over the doorway, the second hand snapping in rhythm. Now they had 7 minutes and 52 seconds. Cold water, Naheed said suddenly. Yeah, and we can time which hand you can keep in cold water longer, Eliza said. What do we need? A timer. And ice cubes and a big bowl. 6 minutes. Both girls were writing on their worksheets. Eliza looked up. She was done. She smiled at Naheed. Why do you wear that head covering? Naheed tried to ignore her. It had worked for Mrs. Salinger with that boy in the back of the room. She pretended to be still working on her worksheet. Huh? Why do you? Eliza continued a little louder, as if the reason Naheed had an answer had to do with a hearing problem. Is it the same as how my Nana keeps her head covered with a wig or a big scarf? She's Orthodox. Is it like that? Naheed looked around the room to see if anyone else was listening. She did not want to talk about her hijab. Anyone else would have figured that out and stopped asking, but not Eliza. So, again, I understand where Naheed's uncomfortable with the questions Eliza's asking, but rather than just being direct with her and putting an end to the questions, Naheed's trying to ignore her or avoid the topic, and it really just seems to be making Eliza worse. Like Eliza wants the answer more because Naheed's withholding it. So this was not the best strategy for Naheed to use. Let's continue. Next to them, Tommy and Sebastian were still balling up paper, although now they were using it like a stress ball and seeing which hand could squeeze it tighter. Do you have to wear it? Eliza went on. If Naheed didn't say something, the whole class was going to start looking this way. And just because they had seen Naheed's head covering for 3 years didn't mean they understood or didn't notice. But it was too late. Tommy and Sebastian seemed more interested in anything else than in their science experiment. Yeah, Naheed, why do you have to wear that? Isn't it hot under there? Tommy asked. It wasn't. Sebastian laughed. I remember in 3rd grade when you first wore it. I thought you'd lost all your hair like you were sick or something. Isn't that crazy? Yes. In fact, Naheed had long and very thick black hair. It was one of the things she loved most about herself. It was just like her mother's. So why do you do it, Naheed? Eliza asked one more time. Wearing pajamas to school might have been better than this. The last thing she wanted to do was explain why. It was as if all of a sudden Naheed was a giant in the room with an endless skein of cotton on her head, and everyone was staring at her and it. I don't know, Eliza, Naheed said. Why do you have to be so annoying? Which seemed to do the trick. The questions stopped. but it also sent Tommy and Sebastian into full-out hysterics. And then Eliza looked like she was about to cry. Annoying Eliza. Tommy laughed. That's a good one, Naheed. Eliza's mouth was twitching more than ever, and tears were filling up her eyes. Naheed had never seen anyone start to fall apart so quickly. Sebastian echoed the sentiment. Yeah, that's a good one. The boys said it in unison and repeated it a few times for good measure, like a Greek chorus. Annoying Eliza, annoying Eliza. The attention had shifted, and Naheed could feel herself returning to her normal size, but she also felt really bad. Eliza hadn't done anything wrong. She was just trying to make friends, and she didn't know how. The boys were still laughing. 5 minutes left. Life science couldn't be over fast enough. So what we're seeing Naheed do in this situation is something called deflecting, which basically just means she didn't want to deal with the situation, so she tried to put the attention on someone else. So she deflected the negative attention from herself to Eliza. She basically threw the girl under the bus. And so as a result, we see that these boys, who were not terribly mature themselves, started picking on Eliza and seemed to enjoy it quite a bit. Unfortunately, this is how the class period ends. So Eliza, who really was just asking questions out of curiosity, leaves with hurt feelings and seems to be, tears in her eyes. She's falling apart. And Naheed leaves actually feeling quite bad. In a moment after she, snapped at Eliza, she felt relief, like she was no longer the center of attention. But then she knows how negatively she felt about being the center of attention, and she turned around and did it to someone else. So she's got some guilt over this, as she should. So what we're going to see the next time we deal with Naheed is how she copes with the situation she's created. Because let's keep in mind that part of growing up is taking responsibility for your actions and your words. So that takes us to the end of section 5. And our next section we will work on together will be, look at that, Will in Shanksville. So we'll see you back here for section 6.